August 7, 1944. The road network south and east of Mortagne, in the rolling farmland of Lower Normandy. For 6 hours before dawn, German armor drawn from 4 panzer divisions has been moving forward under cover of darkness in an operation that Adolf Hitler has personally ordered and personally named, over the direct and documented objections of the Field Marshal, now responsible for executing it. An offensive intended to drive west to the coast at Avranches, sever the American forces that have broken out of Normandy from their supply lines, and reverse in a single stroke a strategic situation that every senior German commander in France, with the singular exception of Hitler himself, regards by this point as beyond reversal. The attack achieves initial surprise. German tanks push several miles through thinly held American positions in the pre-dawn darkness, and for a handful of hours the operation appears, to the forward commanders reporting back through radio channels not yet compromised by what is about to happen, to be proceeding according to a plan that has, on paper, a coherent operational logic. Then the sun rises over Normandy. The low morning cloud that has grounded Allied aircraft since midnight begins to burn away, and the character of the battle changes, in a manner that the Field Marshal receiving reports at Army Group B headquarters will spend the remainder of his brief command trying, without success, to make Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia understand. The German columns caught in daylight on the roads east of Mortagne, moving in the close-packed formations that 4 hours of successful night advance have encouraged forward commanders to maintain, are not encountering resistance in the form German commanders have spent 5 years training to expect. They are not being stopped by American artillery, or American armor, or American infantry defending fixed positions, though all 3 of these will eventually contribute to the operation's collapse. They are being destroyed from directly overhead, by aircraft that have appeared over the battlefield within roughly 90 minutes of first light, in numbers that German air reconnaissance, such as it remains capable of functioning at all by August 1944, has consistently underestimated in every planning assessment produced before the operation began. American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, operating in what forward German commanders describe in radio traffic, intercepted and later reconstructed by Allied signals intelligence as an almost continuous rotation, rather than the intermittent strikes German armored doctrine has been built to withstand, are working the length of every visible road, tree line, and hedgerow gap through which the attacking panzer divisions must move. A single Panther or Panzer IV, however heavily armored against ground fire, presents from directly above an unmistakable silhouette against the pale Norman farmland, and the specific vulnerability of German armor to attack from above, a vulnerability every tank design of the war shares to some degree, because armor thickness is allocated according to the threat expected from the front and sides rather than from the sky, is being exploited by aircraft carrying rockets and heavy machine gun fire in a volume the operations planners simply did not model into their assumptions about how quickly the attack could reach its objectives. The Field Marshal receiving these reports at Army Group B headquarters in the first week of August 1944 is Günther von Kluge, and the specific manner in which he receives them, and the specific conclusion his own communications to Hitler's headquarters draw from them in the days that follow, place him in an unusual position among the senior German commanders of the Normandy campaign. A position shaped by a military career that, unlike Moddel's improvisational reputation or Rommel's public celebrity, was built almost entirely within the conventional, methodical, general staff-trained tradition of the old Prussian officer corps. And that makes his response to the Mortagne air attacks a specific kind of professional crisis. The crisis of a commander whose entire analytical framework for assessing a battle's progress has been trained to weight ground force correlation, tank numbers against tank numbers, division strength against division strength, and who is now confronting a battlefield in which that framework no longer describes the decisive variable at all. Kluge's career before 1944 is, in the specific professional sense that distinguishes him from officers like Moddel, a career of orthodox advancement through the institutional structures of the German army, rather than a career built on crisis improvisation. Commissioned before the First World War, wounded and decorated in that conflict, retained through the interwar Reichswehr in the small officer cadre that Weimar Germany's treaty restrictions, preserved specifically to train the expanded army Hitler would eventually rebuild, Kluge commanded 4th Army during the invasion of Poland in 1939 and during the campaign in France in 1940, campaigns in which his performance was competent and conventional rather than distinguished by the kind of tactical innovation associated with officers like Guderian or Manstein. It is on the Eastern Front, commanding Army Group Center from December 1941, that Kluge's reputation takes the specific shape it holds by 1944, a reputation built on methodical, carefully prepared defensive management of an enormous and perpetually threatened sector, rather than on offensive brilliance, and a reputation that survives the catastrophic destruction of Army Group Center in June 1944, an operational disaster on a scale that dwarfs even the Stalingrad encirclement in the sheer number of German divisions destroyed, largely because Kluge is transferred west to Normandy in the days immediately before that catastrophe becomes fully apparent, arriving in France on July 3, 1944, to replace Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West, at the precise moment the Normandy campaign is entering its most critical phase, and assuming direct command of Army Group B 11 days later, when Rommel is severely wounded by an Allied fighter-bomber attack on his own staff car. An incident whose significance Kluge, in the weeks that follow, does not initially appear to weight with the seriousness it deserves. The intelligence framework Kluge brings to Normandy in July 1944, built from 3 years of Eastern Front command where German air power, though steadily eroding, had not yet collapsed to the point of near total absence over the battlefield, is a framework that assesses the correlation of forces in a battle primarily through the traditional metrics of a general staff education, divisions committed, tanks operational, artillery tubes available, replacement rates against attrition rates. This is not an unreasonable framework in the abstract, and it is the framework that has governed German operational planning since the Franco-Prussian War. What it does not adequately weight, in the specific circumstances Kluge inherits in Normandy, is the near-total Allied command of the air over the battlefield. A condition so complete by the summer of 1944 that Luftwaffe fighter sorties over the entire Normandy front have fallen to a small fraction of the Allied sortie rate, and a condition whose tactical consequences, invisible in a general staff assessment built around division strength tables, become impossible to ignore only when German forces attempt the kind of large-scale daylight offensive maneuver that the Mortain operation requires. The specific technical and tactical development that transforms Allied air superiority from a general strategic disadvantage, the kind of disadvantage every German commander in France has acknowledged in the abstract since the invasion began, into the specific and immediate tactical catastrophe unfolding on the roads around Mortain in early August, is the maturation, over the preceding 2 months of the Normandy campaign, of a close air support system that the American 9th Air Force and the specific fighter-bomber groups, equipped with the P-47 Thunderbolt, have refined into a level of responsiveness and lethality against ground targets that German fighter-bomber doctrine, built around the Luftwaffe's own early war Stuka dive bomber concept, never achieved even at the height of German air power in 1940 and 1941. American forward air controllers, embedded with advancing ground units and equipped with radio links directly to orbiting fighter-bomber formations, are capable of directing strikes against identified German armor within minutes of a target's report, rather than the hours-long process of requesting air support through multiple layers of headquarters that characterized close air support doctrine, German and Allied alike, earlier in the war. The P-47 itself, a heavy, robust single-engine fighter originally designed for high-altitude bomber escort, has proven, through a process of tactical adaptation that American fighter groups in France developed largely through trial and error over the preceding 2 months, to be an unusually effective ground attack platform. Its air-cooled radial engine able to absorb ground fire damage that would destroy a liquid-cooled fighter, its 8 wing-mounted heavy machine guns and underwing rocket rails capable of destroying armored vehicles that earlier war fighter bombers, armed with lighter weapons, could only damage or immobilize. German panzer crews caught in the open by P-47 rocket attacks are, in the after-action reports reaching Kluge's headquarters through the first week of August, describing losses to overhead attack that in some engagements exceed the losses inflicted by American ground forces entirely, an inversion of the loss ratio German armored doctrine has never had to account for on any previous front of the war. The specific engagement that crystallizes this problem for Kluge personally, in a manner that distinguishes his professional understanding of the Mortagne crisis from a purely abstract briefing delivered by staff officers, occurs on August 7th itself, when Kluge's own communications vehicle, a specially equipped radio truck traveling with his forward command party as he moves to personally assess the deteriorating offensive, is caught in the open by an Allied fighter-bomber attack and destroyed, an incident that severs Kluge's direct radio contact with both his forward commanders and with Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, for a period that surviving staff accounts place at several hours, a communications blackout whose consequences extend, in ways Kluge could not have anticipated in the moment, considerably beyond the immediate tactical inconvenience of a field marshal being unable to issue orders. In the specific and increasingly paranoid atmosphere prevailing at Hitler's headquarters in the weeks following the July 20th assassination attempt, an atmosphere in which Kluge's own name has already been raised, through his documented prior contact with several of the officers involved in the conspiracy, as a subject of suspicion that Kluge's chief of staff will later testify, Kluge was aware of and deeply anxious about. Several hours of unexplained radio silence from a field marshal already under suspicion of disloyalty, is interpreted, by officers around Hitler, inclined to read the worst possible motive into any ambiguous circumstance, not as the straightforward battlefield consequence of an Allied air attack destroying a radio truck, but as evidence that Kluge has used the interruption to establish unauthorized contact with Allied forces, a suspicion that will follow Kluge through the remaining days of his command, and that will contribute directly to his recall and the subsequent chain of events that ends his life. What moves through Army Group B's communications to Hitler's headquarters in the days following the Mortagne attack's collapse, once radio contact is restored, is a body of tactical reporting from Kluge that his own staff officers, in post-war accounts given to Allied historical interviewers cataloging the campaign's German side, describe as increasingly direct, in a manner that departed from Kluge's characteristically cautious and diplomatically phrased earlier communications with Hitler's headquarters. Kluge's assessment, communicated through channels that by early August 1944 are themselves straining under the general collapse of German military administration in France, is that the Mortagne offensive's failure cannot be attributed to any deficiency in the German forces committed. Forces that by every conventional metric of tank quality, crew training, and tactical leadership remained, even at this late stage of the war, generally superior on a unit-for-unit basis to the American armored forces directly opposing them. The offensive failed, in Kluge's own phrasing as his staff subsequently reconstructed, because it required daylight movement across open terrain that German ground forces could no longer execute at any scale, without accepting a rate of destruction from the air that no offensive tempo could outpace, a conclusion that carried, though Kluge's own communications stopped short of stating it in these explicit terms to a headquarters that had already demonstrated its unwillingness to hear such assessments from other commanders, the implication that the entire operational concept of a mobile, offensive-minded German army in the West, the concept the Wehrmacht had built its entire doctrine around since the 1930s, was no longer executable against an opponent holding the degree of air superiority the Allies now held over Normandy. The pattern the Mortagne air attacks represent becomes, in the days and weeks immediately following, not an isolated tactical setback confined to a single failed offensive, but the defining characteristic of the entire Falaise encirclement that follows directly from Mortagne's failure. As the German forces that had advanced west toward Avranches find themselves, once the offensive's failure becomes undeniable, even to Hitler's headquarters, attempting to withdraw eastward through an increasingly narrow gap between advancing American and British forces, a withdrawal that must, by the basic geography of the terrain and the collapsing perimeter, be conducted substantially in daylight, and that becomes, through the third week of August 1944, one of the most sustained and effective applications of tactical air power against a retreating army in the entire war. The roads and lanes of the Falaise pocket, jammed with the vehicles, horse-drawn transport, and armor of an entire army group attempting to escape encirclement, become what surviving German accounts and subsequent Allied battle damage assessments alike describe as a killing ground sustained over days rather than hours. Allied fighter bombers, joined now by medium bombers and artillery observation aircraft directing ground fire, With an efficiency the compressed pocket's terrain makes unusually easy, working the length of every escape route in a campaign of destruction that post-war analysis would identify as one of the most concentrated applications of air power against ground forces achieved in the European theater. Kluge himself does not survive to command the withdrawal's final phase. Recalled by Hitler on August 15th, replaced in command by Field Marshal Walter Model, the same officer whose later assessment of American artillery technology would be reconstructed through a parallel set of captured records 4 months afterward. Kluge, traveling back toward Germany under circumstances that both his own staff and post-war historians agree he understood as almost certainly leading to arrest and interrogation over his suspected knowledge of the July plot, takes his own life by poison near Metz on August 19, 1944, 3 days before reaching German soil. Kluge, like Model after him, does not survive to produce the kind of post-war memoir through which officers such as Guderian or Manstein were able to shape, in their own words and according to their own later interests, the historical record of their wartime professional judgments. What Kluge leaves instead, and what has allowed historians reconstructing his final assessment of the Normandy campaign a documentary basis nearly as direct as any memoir, is a single letter, written in the hours before his death and addressed to Hitler personally, a document recovered by German authorities and subsequently made available to Allied historical researchers after the war, in which Kluge, freed by his own impending death from any further need to manage Hitler's perception of him, sets down in his final communication a judgment about the war's Western Front that his official reports through the chain of command had never been able to state with comparable directness. The letter's substance, as historians who have studied the document describe its content, does not dwell on tactics or on the specific fighter-bomber campaign that had destroyed the Mortain offensive and was, at the moment of Kluge's death, still destroying Army Group B's remaining forces in the closing pocket at Falaise. It dwells instead on a broader judgment that the war in the West could no longer be won against an opponent whose material and air superiority had become so overwhelming that German battlefield performance, however capable at the tactical and unit level, no longer constituted a variable capable of altering the war's eventual outcome, and it urges upon Hitler, in terms that Kluge's own life and death lend a particular weight, a political resolution to the conflict that German military means alone could no longer secure. This final assessment, reconstructed through a letter written by a dying man rather than through the retrospective, self-interested narrative construction of a post-war memoir, places Kluge's professional judgment about the Mortain and Falaise fighting in a specific analytical category that historians of the Normandy campaign have subsequently identified as distinct from, though related to, the broader German recognition of Allied material superiority that pervades nearly every German account of the war's Western Front, from 1944 onward. What Kluge's communications through the first 3 weeks of August 1944, both his official reports to Hitler's headquarters and his final private letter, specifically emphasize, in a way that distinguishes his assessment from a generalized acknowledgement of Allied strength, is the particular and total character of Allied air superiority as a variable that had, by August 1944, moved beyond a disadvantaged German ground forces could compensate for, through superior tactics or equipment quality, becoming instead a condition that made an entire category of operation, the large-scale daylight offensive maneuver that had been the German Army's signature method of war since 1939, functionally impossible to execute at any acceptable cost. Guderian's earlier assessment of the Sherman tank, reconstructed from his own post-war memoir, had concerned the specific and bounded question of how German intelligence had misjudged one weapon system's operational characteristics. Kluge's assessment, reconstructed from wartime communications and a final private letter rather than a memoir, with the luxury of retrospective refinement, concerns something considerably larger, the question of whether an entire operational tradition, the offensive, mobile warfare, the German army had built its doctrine and its institutional identity around for a generation, remained viable at all against an opponent capable of contesting German forces not merely on the ground, but in a third dimension, the air above the battlefield. That German doctrine had never developed the institutional capacity to contest on comparable terms. The broader lesson that Kluge's documented assessment offers, considered alongside the parallel case of Model's confrontation with American artillery technology 4 months later, is a lesson about the specific and compounding way that isolated tactical developments, a fighter-bomber's rocket attack on a single road junction, a proximity fuse detonating 15 meters above a single tree line, accumulate across an entire theater of war into a strategic condition that no single German commander, however capable at the tactical level, possessed the institutional means to reverse. Kluge's career, built on the methodical general staff tradition of correlating divisions against divisions, tanks against tanks, had prepared him to assess and respond to nearly every category of battlefield development the German army had encountered in 5 years of war on multiple continents. It had not prepared him, because no German officer's career could have prepared him, for a battlefield in which the decisive variable had migrated so completely into a domain, sustained tactical air power directed with a responsiveness and volume no Luftwaffe doctrine had ever achieved even at Germany's own military zenith. That the entire vocabulary of divisions and tank numbers through which Kluge had been trained to read a battle's outcome had become, by the second week of August 1944, a description of a war that was no longer the war actually being fought above the roads of Normandy. What the Mortagne and Falaise fighting ultimately represents, in the specific terms that Kluge's wartime communications and his final letter allow historians to reconstruct without the mediating hand of a post-war memoir's retrospective self-justification, is not primarily a story about a single failed offensive or even about the destruction of an army group, however consequential that destruction proved to the remainder of the campaign in France. It is a story about the specific vulnerability of a military institution whose doctrine, however refined through years of continuous combat, had been built around an assumption of rough parity, or at minimum contestability, in every domain of the battlefield, and about what happens to that institution's operational logic when one domain, the air above the ground where its armies must move, is no longer contestable at all. Günther von Kluge, a methodical and conventionally trained officer whose entire professional formation had taught him to read a battle through the correlation of ground forces, found in the final weeks of his command and the final hours of his life that the correlation he had spent a career learning to calculate no longer described the war he was fighting, that an army capable, division for division and tank for tank, of matching its opponent on the ground could nonetheless be destroyed in a matter of days once that opponent controlled, without meaningful contest, the sky above every road that army needed to move upon, and that no tactical adjustment available to a field marshal on the ground could restore a correlation of forces that had already been decided, before a single panzer division moved toward Mortagne, in a domain the German army had never built the institutional capacity to contest.